Hello and welcome to the latest episode of Material Matters with Grant Gibson. I've done well over 100 shows now. However, for listeners who might be new to all this, the idea is I speak to a designer, maker, artist or architect about a material or technique with which they're intrinsically linked and discover how it changed their lives and careers. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Nicole Rycroft. Nicole is the founder and executive director of the award-winning environmental not-for-profit Canopy. Since it launched in 1999, the Vancouver-based organisation has worked with more than 950 companies, including Marks & Spencer's, Tesco and Puma, to, in its words, develop innovative solutions and make their supply chains more sustainable to help protect our world's remaining ancient and endangered forests. It started by looking at the book industry and persuading publishers to use more recycled paper, before turning its attention to packaging and fashion, shining a light on the industry's use of viscose in particular. Nicole has won a slew of awards. She's the recipient of a Canadian Environmental Award Gold Medal, winner of the 2020 Climate Breakthrough Award, and was recently named in the Business of Fashion's top 500 most influential people. Nicole, thank you very, very much for doing this. How are you?
Grant, you have me blushing first thing in the morning. Nice to be here.
Oh, it's lovely to have you. And you're obviously a morning person because where you are, it's 3 o'clock in the afternoon where I am. It's 7 o'clock in the morning where you are.
It is.
Yeah.
As shocking as that may be, this is not my earliest call this week.
Oh, my word.
So thank you for the sleep in.
No, that's absolutely fine. I mean, I'm incapable of any kind of thought at the time of day that you're talking at me quite fluently. So thank you very much. Nicole, you're not an artist, designer, architect or maker, or at least you've not any of those in your professional life. When I was writing the intro, I was going to use the word activist, but I wonder if that's how you see yourself.
Yeah, I mean, I don't shy away from the word activist. I mean, sometimes I describe myself as a professional tree hugger. Sometimes I'm labeled a social entrepreneur or a change maker. But I think with working not within the creative industries as a designer or a textile manufacturer, rather as a kind of like an ecosystem catalyst or enabler for change, with a real focus on sustainability, then, I've been labeled many things, as you can imagine, over the last 25 years. Sometimes kind of conservation issues can be a little contentious.
Yes.
So activist is fine.
Good. Can I ask where you are? I tell you for why. We have a tradition on this podcast because when it started 6 years ago, I used to visit makers in their workshops of getting guests to describe their environment. Now, we're looking at each other on a screen of a virtual studio. I'm guessing this isn't your office.
No.
So where are you right now?
So I'm in the spare room / makeshift office at home in Vancouver. Just to my right-hand side, there's a beautiful witch hazel tree that unfortunately is in the process of losing its leaves as we kind of move into the darker days of the year.
Tell me about your office. How many people are you?
Yeah, so Canopy is a solutions-driven NGO, and we work to protect the world's forest species, climate, and advance frontline community rights. We do that by transforming supply chains that currently drive deforestation and forest degradation. And we are currently a team of 58. At the beginning of COVID, we were a team of 25. So we've grown quite a lot in the last few years, which is great because it's bringing a lot of additional bench strength for us to be really leaning in with brands, with retailers to help transform both viscose production as well as paper packaging.
And where, with your 58 people, I mean, you can't say where everybody comes from, but what backgrounds do you typically employ people from?
Yeah, so we look for quite an eclectic mix because we are an NGO that's focused on conservation, but we are specialists in supply chain transformation and kind of accelerating the transition away from take, make, waste production that relies on forests to be mowed down every year to make paper or to make textiles to more circular next-gen production. And so we have people that have come from kind of like a beer company sales position, from advertising sales. We have people that have PhDs in conservation biology, people that have worked, on women's rights, as well as from the world of philanthropy and kind of many, many other things in between.
Okay, interesting. Well, look, should we talk a bit more about your work and maybe begin with one of your recent projects, which is the Restart Alliance, which is reimagining textile waste in India.
Mm-hmm.
Why textile waste? Why India for you?
Yeah, I mean, as probably a lot of people that follow your podcast will already be aware of, we overproduce clothing. There's 100 billion items of clothing that are produced every year. 60% of it is in landfill within the first 12 months and 85% of it over its lifetime. And so that is currently placing an incredible burden on landfills. There's incredible pollution associated with it, especially when it's burnt, given how much of the content of clothing and textiles is polyester. And so it's akin to burning plastic. And we feel that, or we believe and know that this waste product is an underutilized resource that can be fed back in to the production supply chain and can become, next season's clothing rather than degrading into methane and putting stress on our climate.
But India in particular?
India is really well positioned to be an early leader in next gen, what we call next gen materials. And by next gen, I mean, rather than us going into a forest, mowing down 300 million trees, sending that to a pulp mill to then have it be turned into viscose, which is what happens every year. Next-gen materials use inputs that are more circular, that have a fundamentally lighter footprint, and that are byproducts of other processes. So it can be waste textiles, it can be agricultural residues, so straw that's left over after the food grain harvest, or even industrial food waste is excellent as a source of cellulose, which is essentially what viscose or rayon or lyocell is made from. And so India is incredibly rich in these alternative or next-gen inputs. It's one of the world's largest textile manufacturing sectors. It has a lot of agricultural residues there. It also stands out in that it is already a competitive and reliable sourcing region for global brands with well-established infrastructure. And so that combination of being rich with next-gen feedstocks, it's got 100 million tons of agricultural residues, it's got over 7 million tons of recycled textiles, as well as the fact that it's well-positioned as a production center, makes it very competitively positioned.
Right. I thought you were going there because it receives vast amounts of textiles from the global north, I guess.
It does.
But it's actually the fact that it's got all these agricultural residues that makes it as interesting.
Yes, it's the combination of both. It definitely does receive a lot of recycled textile waste from the north, as well as the fact that it's already got a rich textile manufacturing sector. And so the byproduct, the cuttings off the floor, the domestic recycling of textiles means that there is, I think it's just shy now of 8 million tons of textile waste every year.
And I mean, this started, I believe, the project started with a conference last December entitled Sorting for Circularity India Project. So practically in the 12 months, what's happened since then?
Yeah, I mean, we have big goals as a coalition or as an alliance, and the Restart Alliance is a combination of organizations. So it's Canopy, Fashion for Good, IDH, and the Loudest Foundation. And we are working to bring 1 million tons of recycled textiles back into global supply chains to advance circular economy. And a lot of that work is happening around creating the enabling conditions to help scale and unlock the full value of textile waste. It is initially focused in India, doesn't mean that's where we'll stop, but because of the reasons that we've already discussed, we felt that the conditions in India were a great place to get things rolling. There have been conversations with the Ministry of Fashion and Textiles in India around roles that the government can play in helping to create enabling conditions, the policy levers that will be necessary. There's work happening with textile recyclers. Just over 50% of the textiles that are in India or textile waste are already being recycled, which is very high globally.
That is, yeah.
But much of it is in the informal recycling economy and it's being downcycled. And so it's not really being valorized, as well as the fact that there's a real focus on textile recycling of just the high cellulosic, so textiles or clothing pieces that have more than 70%. Those textiles that have larger percentages of polyester or other synthetics aren't actually being taken out of the waste stream. And oftentimes they're being sent to the brick kilns or to be burnt, which is creating significant pollution pressures. And so we'll be working on both higher value and maintenance in the textile stream of the high cotton percentage textile, as well as some of these new and disruptive technologies like circ come to scale, ensuring that these higher kind of blended polyester textiles are also being diverted and that there's better financial returns for both the informal recycling kind of system that there is, as well as it becomes more formalized.
Tell me about circ. What is circ for people who don't know?
Yeah, sure. So circ is a fantastic technology venture. They're a textile to textile recycling fiber company, and they have the ability to take textiles that are a blend of polyester and cotton or viscose, and through a pressurized process, they can separate out the recycled cellulose as well as the recycled PET. And so then you have two pure streams of fiber that can be fed back into viscose production as well as into recycled polyester production. They're currently at a commercial pilot stage and are on the precipice of choosing their site for their first commercial scale facility. So we anticipate they should be online in 2026.
Very good. I mean, it's interesting because as an organization, you started kind of in the paper industry. Canopy began by targeting book publishers and persuading high-profile authors to print their books on recycled paper. So how did you move from that into fashion, from persuading The Guardian in London to change its paper stock to dealing with issues around textile waste in India? Feels like a little bit of a leap.
A little bit of a hop.
Yeah, a hop. I like that. It's not a leap, it's a hop. Yeah.
I think anybody who saw my fashion sense, my dress sense in 2010 probably would have thought that it was a leap as well.
I'm laughing at that. That's really rude. I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's okay. I'm happy to laugh at myself around it as well. We have done a lot of work initially, or we did a lot of work initially and continue to with book publishers, magazine publishers, newspaper publishers, which have obviously in terms of their volume of paper being used in newsprint, a lot of that has shifted from the early 2000s into more of an online format. But then we recognized that there were a lot of mills globally that were slated for conversion to become dissolving pulp mills. And so we were like, what does dissolving pulp go into? And essentially the lion's share, 80% of dissolving pulp is utilized in textiles and other kind of woven products. And so it was a sector and a forest product that had been growing steadily year on year. It had doubled in the decade just prior to it really popping on our radar screen, and it was slated to double again. And so what we recognized was that here we are at this juncture of this supply chain that is having a devastating impact on forest ecosystems, these carbon and biodiversity rich forests that we need to keep standing to hit planetary targets, to have a stable climate, to have a stable and vibrant biodiversity, as well as for Indigenous communities whose often these forests are the traditional territories of. Here's a sector that is at this inflection point, and if we were engaged now, we can redirect it to be fundamentally more sustainable before it's built billions and billions of dollars worth of new infrastructure in exactly the wrong places, right? Like we don't need dissolving pulp mills in the middle of the Amazon or in the middle of the boreal forest or in Indonesia's rainforest. We can actually build mills to provide next season's clothing closer to urban centers so that there's less strain on municipality waste streams. We can build it next to the straw fields where every year straw is burnt after the food grain harvest. And so that's really been the work with Canopy Style, is building a fence at the top of the cliff rather than a hospital at the bottom, which is so often the case with environmental issues. You're often chasing the train down the track after it's already pulled out of the station and is about to disappear over the chasm. Here was basically our work has been to work with brands to essentially send the right signals to create the right economic incentives for there to be a change in business as usual in this supply chain.
As you've mentioned, Nicole, viscose is primarily made of wood.
Mm-hmm.
I think it was invented at the end of the 19th century and became a kind of industrial product. I think Courtaulds in Britain was the first company to use it in 1905.
You've done your history lessons.
I've done a little bit. Yeah, that history degree came in handy, let me tell you. I mean, I'm kind of intrigued. When you talk to people, not of the fashion world, or consumers, the people who are using this stuff, one, are they aware of viscose as a material? And two, if they are, do they know what it's made of?
Yeah, no one knows. Even we were surprised. And to be honest, when we first started working with brands, a lot of the brands were surprised as well.
Really? The brands didn't know what their own material was made of?
Some of them, for sure. They were actually surprised that it was coming from vibrant forests, that it was made from wood. I think what technically is more correct is that viscose needs to be made from cellulose. Now, currently, the majority of that is coming from forests. It's coming from trees. Some of it's a little bit is made from cotton linters or from bamboo, but the vast majority is coming from those 300 million trees that are mowed down every year. 40% of that forest fiber is coming from high carbon and biodiverse forests, what we would call ancient and endangered forests. But it doesn't have to, because really what the core element of viscose is cellulose. And cellulose is found in any plant matter, anywhere. And so that's really part of this work moving forward. There's been a proud tradition commercially since the early 20th century, right? Since the early 1900s, 1920s or so, when it really started to be at a commercial scale production. It's still a relatively young supply chain. It's really a relic of the last century now that we're in the 21st century, grappling with all the variabilities that come with supply chains, given the impacts of the climate crisis. And so this kind of this transition to more circular next-gen production is really, I think it's an exciting juncture to be at, an exciting part of the puzzle to be playing with.
Can I concentrate on wood for a moment?
Sure.
Because it's quite an interesting one. I think it's worthwhile trying to hack out a path for people who sometimes feel that they're receiving conflicting advice.
Mm-hmm.
In this podcast, I talk to people from the construction industry, architects, for example, quite a lot. And there's a lot of chatter about how wood is the future because it's regenerative and processing it uses a lot less carbon than steel and concrete. But fundamentally, what you're saying is it's a question of where the wood is coming from.
Yeah, it is really difficult for designers, for architects, for brands to cut through the data, right? There's a lot of conflicting data out there. There are a lot of studies. And as we all know, what you choose to measure really greatly influences how ultimately the results show up. And so what will often happen with a life cycle analysis, so a study of the full impacts of a product relative to each other, what will often happen, forest product, is that the study of impact starts basically at the manufacturing level. It doesn't account for the biogenic carbon, so the carbon that is stored below the soils and above the soils in a forest ecosystem. And the vast majority of the climate footprint and almost all of the impact on biodiversity is actually at that stage when a forest is actually cut down and the trees are then shipped to the mill. Once it's at the mill, then, yes, from a pulp perspective, it's incredibly chemical intensive. There's a lot of water being used. It's energy intensive. But the vast majority of the impact, the damaging impact of wood products is actually often not accounted for in those studies that people are often having kind of fly across their screens. It's part of the kind of blur of information and misinformation that there is in today's world that people are having to cut through to make decisions. And so that's part of our work with brands, is helping them discern which information and data is credible and should be part of their consideration matrix for how they work out what are preferred materials. And then we work with them to also assess who should be preferred suppliers if they're looking through the lenses of risk of sourcing from high carbon and high kind of biodiversity forests, if they're looking at who's actually really helping kind of spearhead the transition to more circular production.
And this is the hot button report, which investigates the products that producers create are coming from and the risks they pose to deforestation.
Yeah, so every year we produce the hot button report, and it does look at the top, I think it's 30 plus or minus one or two on either side, viscose and man-made cellulosic textile producers globally. They account for 90+% of global MMCF or viscose and cellulosic textile production. And we rate them across, currently it's 28 different criteria. If a producer has a green shirt, then they represent low risk of having sourced from a high carbon, high biodiversity value forest, and or they're taking really active steps to address any risk that they do have in their supply chain. If a producer has red in their shirt, even if it's just a partial red, then it means that there is high risk. There's been identified high risk of sourcing from one of these really critical forest ecosystems. And then we have a gradation of different colors in between. And if companies are being really proactive around advancing conservation, sustainable sourcing, as well as advancing these more circular next-gen materials and pulling those through into conventional production, mainstream production, then they can even get a dark green shirt. So that report, I think, comes out in another 2 weeks or something.
Okay. So you're busy crunching data. I mean, all these companies, are they transparent with you? I'm presuming that not everyone is willing to take part, or do they feel compelled?
It's definitely become the go-to tool that brands and retailers in the fashion industry use to help guide their purchasing decisions when it comes to viscose textiles. And so that has definitely been a motivator for a lot of the producers to actually lean in and be responsive. There are a few that choose more to just let us glean information from what's publicly available. We do always share what we've been able to find and ask for verification and if there's anything that's been missed. So that process takes place over many, many months, as you can imagine. We also have a third-party audit that's associated, separate too, but it's one of the elements that feeds into the hot button assessment.
But some of these supply chains must be incredibly hard to trace, I'm guessing.
Yeah, which is why there's value in a third-party auditor actually going in to really assess where is kind of the stated chain of custody, really kind of what's on the books as their sourcing and chain of custody. And I think that's been one of the things over the last, it's 10 years now since we launched the Canopy style initiative, that viscose was a very long, opaque supply chain. And so a big part of our work has been to actually create a line of sight as to which forests are actually being logged and ending up in viscose textiles so that brands can be making more informed decisions. You know, when people think of viscose, this probably comes back to the question that you asked earlier on. It isn't an intuitive link that a tree that stands tall in a forest ecosystem, something that can give you a splinter, ultimately becomes that soft, silky fabric that's next to your skin. But the metamorphosis is a very intense kind of breakdown of wood fiber into the pure cellulose. And viscose production has three primary impact areas at the moment. It's impact on forests, as we've already spoken about. There's the chemical processing. It's a very intense chemical process and very water intensive as well. As you can imagine, to take a tree or 300 million of them in a forest and then start to sort of strip out just the cellulose. And so there's basically the tree gets logged, it gets sent to a pulp mill and put in a giant blender with a lot of water and a lot of chemicals and cooked. And so it's quite energy intensive as well. And then out of that, you will end up, depending on the pulp mill and how efficient it is, with 22 to 40% of that tree coming out the other side as cellulose, which then gets sent to the viscose mill and thrown through a spinneret with a lot of other chemicals and sophisticated process. And out of that, you end up with the cellulosic fiber that kind of looks like cotton. But the process itself is both wasteful, chemically intensive, and devastating in terms of forests and our climate. And when you take a cotton T-shirt, 100% cotton T-shirt, and you feed it in to into the viscose process and pulp process, then what you end up with out the other side is significantly less water, 60% less water, 4 tons less carbon per ton of product, 5 times less impact on biodiversity, and almost 100% of that T-shirt that you put in at the front end actually comes out the other end to be made back into clothing.
Yeah. I mean, I think you might have covered quite a lot of this, but you've also launched a scheme called the Next Generation Action Plan that I was reading on your website this morning, which you've dubbed a pulp thriller, which I rather like. It talks of common sense approaches, groundbreaking endeavors, and technological innovation. What does that entail, those 3 things?
I think what we're trying to say there is that we have brilliant, smart chemists and entrepreneurs that are coming up with solutions to waste and coming up with fibers and technology solutions for how we make clothing in a fundamentally more sustainable way. These are elegant solutions to the current problems that we're grappling with. The ecological crises, increasing geopolitical instabilities, also disrupting supply chains. And really what needs to happen is that these solutions need to be scaled, which requires both the market to be very clear in sending the signal and then stepping in and pulling those solutions through to market, as well as for us to be mobilizing the scale of investment and enabling policy conditions to enable them to move from commercial pilot scale, like has been the case with Cirque and Avenue and a number of other very promising innovations, through to commercial scale. And for the conventional producers that are already specialists in these supply chains to be able to adopt either some of those technologies or develop their own in-house technology so that they can start diversifying their fiber basket and retrofitting some of their machines over to be more circular. And so that's really what's at the essence of Survival, a pulp thriller.
Yeah.
Is that we have the solutions, we have the technologies, we just need to actually scale them.
Yeah, and to scale them, you need money. And your target is to find $69 billion for a combination of new mills and to plant new plantations.
Yeah, we've actually done a little bit of back of the envelope upgrade since we published Survival. And so we are aiming sort of by 2033 to have 60 million tons of next gen pulp on the market. And that's for both textiles as well as paper and packaging. And we're estimating that the price tag for that infrastructure transition to build those mills or to retrofit existing mills, that'll be about $78 billion.
Okay.
Sounds like a lot of money. But when we were writing Survival, we realized that the company that produced Botox sold for $68 billion. And we were like, okay, well, if the world can afford $68 billion for Botox, then surely we can afford $78 billion to save the planet.
Yeah. As a consumer, other than buying less, obviously, or secondhand, what should consumers be looking for? I mean, is there something they can look at on the label to tell them that this is a garment that they should be buying?
Yeah, I mean, I think your first 2 points are really important. You know, retail therapy is a curative thing. And when we buy clothing, then really thinking about, is this something that I can see myself in, like, you know, a year from now, 5 years from now, 25 years from now? That is a really good question and impulse to have. You know, there are wonderful, wonderful outfits. Most of, I would say 95% of my wardrobe, if not higher, is secondhand clothing. And so those 2 are very good first stops. When buying new, then, you know, increasingly brands are pulling these early to market next gen solutions through. They will be labeling them either on a hang tag or kind of on the garment label itself. And so I think it's really important both to look for those specific clothing items, as well as to actually support the brands that are being leaders. So the designers and the retailers that are really stepping in.
Who is leading it, Nicole? I mean, Stella McCartney is always quoted, but there are others.
Yeah. So we work now with more than 550 brands, designers, retailers, and they do range from the Targets of the world to Zara and H&M to Stella and Louis Vuitton. They're all leaning in to, ensure that high carbon and high biodiversity value forests aren't ending up in your little black dress. And they're also all working together with Canopy, but in a pre-competitive space, recognizing that no single company can kind of spur a new supply chain or kind of create a new supply chain all by themselves. And so we've created a pre-competitive space for brands and retailers to work with us and to work with the conventional supply chain, as well as these really kind of disruptive innovators to help scale the production of these lower impact solutions. And so, you will have some of the big brands and big retailers like Zara, like H&M. You will have pace setters like Eileen Fisher and Stella McCartney. And then, some of the brands within the Kering group, Puma. And so it's quite a varied range. We have all of our partners listed on our website if folks are wanting to check. But I think we're in that transition period at the moment where we have brands leaning in to encourage investment into the space, encourage their conventional producers to be pulling these through into the production, these solutions through into the production system. And there's always a little bit of a chicken and egg kind of stage with new production systems really kicking in. And so there are still currently only small amounts of next-gen material that are on the market. But if you're going into stores, you can see it labeled. But it's really, I think, over the next 5 years, we're going to see that change very, very dramatically.
See an increase.
Yeah. And so supporting the brands and the designers that are really kind of helping to spearhead that transition and accelerate that transition over these next couple of years is really important.
And where did this all start for you? Because you were born in Australia, you're a physiotherapist,
yes,
as well as a very successful rower. I mean, how successful were you at rowing, in fact?
I can sit in a boat and go backwards pretty quickly. Yeah.
Quicker than most.
Quicker than most, yes. The Thames is a little different than I grew up rowing on Sydney Harbour.
Okay.
And the river system off Sydney Harbour. So a little bit less tidal than the Thames is prone to. But still, we've always had a good rivalry, I think, with, the UK and Canada when it comes to holding our own.
So did you row for Australia? Is that what you're saying?
I did not, actually. My doubles partner and my coach went to the World Championships and I stayed home sick. I got a virus that basically knocked out my immune system and basically knocked me out of rowing altogether. So I missed my kind of international spot.
Oh, that sounds gutting. I'm sorry.
It was pretty devastating at the time, I have to say. I kind of did stay home feeling a little bit sore and sorry for myself and very, very unwell. I couldn't walk to the corner shop and back.
Oh, wow.
To go from being national level athlete to really not being able to walk 400 meters to the corner shop and back without having to take a break a couple of times. It was very humbling and it really brought into sharp focus what is important to me in life and how do I want to be engaging? Where do I want my life force to go? And so as painful as it was at the moment and at that time, it feels like such a gift to have had that moment of pause to really work out.
How long did it take to get over, Nicole?
It took me 7 years until I didn't pick up just anything that was going around.
Wow.
It took me kind of 18 months until I was back up and 90%.
Were you doing rowing professionally? Is that what then encouraged you into physiotherapy?
No, I was a physiotherapist first. Yeah, I was a physiotherapist first and then just started rowing as because I love the water and it looks so peaceful from the shore when you're in the boat, sometimes it feels like you're arm wrestling your way down, kind of like the entire course. But it's a beautiful, beautiful feeling when you're in the flow. And it's just what if I can't think of a better way to start a day than being on the water, or even a better way to finish the day as the sun goes down. So greeting the day as the sun comes up and goes down on the water, it's a different feel to life.
Because you surf now, right?
I do. But when I first started Canopy, I was like, okay, holy hell. Like, I've been a physiotherapist and a jock, basically. What do those have? Like, what do those have to do with, running an international NGO that's working to protect forests and is going to work with business? And turns out it doesn't actually have anything to do with those things, but there are some core skills, right? Like, if you're a really good physio, then you're not getting distracted with just what the symptom is, right? You're looking at what's the core issue. Is there an instability around someone's pelvis? They've got a pain in their finger. Is it actually coming from their neck, or is it coming from somewhere in the hand? And so you look for, where is the systemic cause of this pain, of this problem? And that's been very helpful with coming into, how do we actually solve the climate crisis? How do we solve the biodiversity crisis? How do we fundamentally make supply chains and businesses more sustainable and break out of this dichotomy of it's a supply and demand world, and therefore we have to just produce products regardless of what the impact is on both humanity and those that we share this planet with, as well as these vibrant forest ecosystems that are part of our lifeline. And so there was that part of it. And then with being an athlete, with being a rower, you are constantly redefining what's possible, right? Like, you are constantly pushing yourself to go faster, be 1% more efficient with each stroke so that you're 20 seconds faster by the time that you get down the course. And that's also really helpful in this line of work. Where we are today, if you try and sort of take incremental steps, we are not going to get to where we need to be. And I think history has shown us time and time again that the unimaginable can become reality much faster than we actually think. And so even though rowing and being a physio didn't necessarily seem like the most classic textbook qualifications for heading up an award-winning NGO that's kind of solutions focused and working with 1,000 plus of the world's largest brands, in some ways it's been perfect. It was perfect training.
Yeah. Is it true that you founded your first environmental organization at the age of 9?
Yeah, I didn't found it. I kind of took over it. I was in primary school, and we had a kind of what was called the Gould League, which was essentially a kind of conservation and parks, a wildlife initiative. So I think it may have been dormant for a year or two, but that would be a little too braggadocious to say that I founded it all by myself. It was kind of more of the resurrection party.
And as I said, you started Canopy in 1999. We're going to leap forward from your 9-year-old self.
Sure.
Did you have a plan of what you wanted to achieve when you started it? Because between being a physiotherapist and starting Canopy, you had been an activist attempting to physically stop loggers in forests in British Columbia. And also you'd worked in Indonesia. You'd done activism in Indonesia as well. What did that entail?
Yeah, it was actually, I traveled from Australia up through the Indonesian archipelago, and I was just looking at, where was Australian aid money being invested. I actually spent close to 2 years in Southeast Asia before I moved to Canada. And during that time, I was doing this work monitoring where Australian aid money was being invested and where there's Australian business interests like coal industry interests close by. I spent a lot of time actually doing some volunteer work on the Thai-Burmese border. And it was actually through that work that I think the seed of Canopy was really planted, in that I was doing some work documenting the link between human rights violations and environmental degradation on the Burmese border. I was in and out of refugee camps and rebel army camps, just documenting the stories of child soldiers, of people that were involved in the struggle against the military regime at that time. And I was writing a report for the EU that was related to Burma's most favored nation status at that time, and feeding in this kind of more frontline very human commentary about the impacts of the regime. It was during that time and that work, and at that time, like there was meant to be an embargo where no international companies were actually doing business in Burma, but that wasn't the case, right? There were a number of them that were in there. They were just in there under kind of different proxies. And so I think it was that work that really helped crystallize for me that we live in this supply and demand world, and that currently sustainability, both environmentally as well as from a human community perspective, isn't being actively factored into it, but doesn't have to be that way, right? It can be just as easily the case, rather than, a supply and demand world being the rationale for leaving kind of like a trail of destruction. A supply and demand world can actually also require humane practices, compassionate kind of practices when it comes to those that are either involved in the workforce or on the front lines of where sourcing and production happens, as well as for sustainability from an environmental perspective to be one of those top criteria as well, alongside of price and availability and quality. And so that was really with that seated in my head that I then moved to Canada, and I felt like I was moving to the belly of the beast of global consumption, right? Like North America is like so much purchasing influence that it just felt very exciting, with starting Canopy to play with that lever for change, for positive change.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting, isn't it? Because, I mean, you were at one point kind of like, by the sound of it, a kind of classical activist. Nowadays, you do deal with big brands and capitalism as it stands. There are plenty of activists who wouldn't do that, but you want to play within the existing system, if you like.
Yeah, I mean, I have stood in front of a bulldozer. I have, with that work, also recognized that I was standing in front of a bulldozer on the top of a mountain in Clayoquot Sound on the west coast of Canada in the temperate rainforest. But there were bulldozers mowing down forests in koala habitat in Australia, in Indonesia's rainforest, in the Amazon, in the boreal, right? There's only so long you can stand in front of a bulldozer. And to actually fundamentally relieve the pressure off forest ecosystems, we have to stop mowing them down to make pizza boxes and t-shirts. And so working to actually build a cadre of powerful champions for that transition just felt like it was a better use of my time. Anyway, I feel like the environmental movement will always have a broad array of tactics and strategies as part of it. I've just felt that for me, that just because I've got professional tree hugger on my business card, which I don't, by the way, but essentially that's kind of what my moniker is.
Always makes me laugh.
Oh, well, that's great. Yeah, I'm not the only person that cares about having a stable climate or clean air or clean water, right? Like the CSO at Intertex or the CEO at a major retailer and brand care just as much about the planet as I do. And really, it's the work with Canopy has been about how do we create vehicles that make it easier for brands and for these champions within companies to actually use their purchasing power to help drive positive change whilst they also do business.
Mm. And how did you physically start Canopy? I mean, was it classically on your kitchen table?
It was classically at the kitchen table,
right,
in Tofino with an $1,800 budget for my first year. So I would literally go surfing of a morning. I would come back. I was writing everything from scratch at that point. And I had sort of the largesse of $1,800 to do it all with, to start off with.
Yeah. And initially you weren't called Canopy. It was Markets Initiatives, I believe.
Yes, it was, which, I can't believe that I lasted like 10 years with Markets Initiative as our name, because with working in the Canadian and in US context, almost no one understands an Australian saying markets, right? Like maybe in Boston they do, but everybody else thought that I was saying Muppets Initiative, Markets Initiative, anything but markets initiative. But at that time, in 1999, think way back, many gray hairs ago for those of us that have gray hair, CSR at that time, corporate social responsibility, was, companies would do a fundraiser for the local boys soccer club, footy club, or they'd, if they were super progressive, then they were doing a fundraiser for the local girls football club as well. But it wasn't common practice for companies to be actually looking at the core operational impacts of their business practices. There was an awareness at that time that 80+% of a company's environmental footprint, their climate impact, was wrapped up in the raw materials, the Scope 3 products that they were purchasing. And so in those early days, there was a lot of cold calling, there was a lot of voicemail, and there was a lot of trying to stay this side of getting a restraining order because of the number of times that I was calling or leaving a voicemail or a message.
Well, you must have had to put up with quite a lot of rejection.
Yeah, I remember there was this one time that I was at the airport in Vancouver, and I think I was heading to New York or Toronto. And it was back before cell phones had really kind of kicked in. I could hear this guy having a conversation on the payphone, and he just sounded like such a cheesy salesman. And it was so clear that the person on the other side of the call was not interested at all. And I had this little moment of existential angst where I was like, oh my God, I'm like this cheesy salesman. Like, no one was really all that interested, with a few notable exceptions, but no one was really geared, like prepared to lean in, like to think about their company and their purchasing as a way that they could help kind of chart a different path for kind of like them as a business, as well as kind of for us as a society more broadly. Thankfully, things have changed though.
Yeah. Well, how does Canopy make its money? I mean, you're not charging the brands for the job that you do.
No, we don't. We made that decision right from the start, right? Like, felt that it was just very important that from a credibility perspective, from an independence perspective, that there was no financial relationship between us or the brands and the companies that we work with. So that if we say Zara is doing a good job, then people can know that Zara is doing a good job, that it's not because there was a $200,000 check that was slid across the table. We have seen with other organizations that as soon as a check gets issued, then it can shift the power balance. And what we actually are looking for with our brand partners is that they roll up their sleeves and they become active champions for environmental change. And that oftentimes when a check kind of gets slid across the table, then there's a little bit more of a sense that this is a contract and more of a transactional partnership rather than a transformational partnership. And so we've just kept money off the table, which means that, me and my team were great at tap dancing for fundraising, that our revenues come from philanthropic institutions, family foundations, or individuals that feel inspired by our work and excited about the impact and the track record that we have, and make personal donations.
Okay. We are coming towards the end of our time, and I know you need breakfast or something.
Say it's not so.
But I can't let you go without talking about Harry Potter. Because Harry Potter is very much part of your story.
Yes, it is.
How did you go about greening the Harry Potter books in 24 countries?
Yeah. So when we first started working with the book publishing industry, there were no environmental papers that were available. Right? There were minimal recycled content. If a publisher wanted to get a high recycled content paper because they had a specific author who really wanted to be on green paper, then it really did cost them, like an arm and a leg, because it was a special run, right? There just wasn't the economy of scale of production. And so we started working with the book publishing industry, and we're gaining some good traction. We started that work here in Canada because at that time it was literally me and the $1,800 and the kitchen table, if you remember. We got good pickup. We had, well-known authors like Margaret Atwood really lean in behind our work, big publishers like Penguin Random House. But in terms of, books that had the kind of game-changing print runs that could really help shift the entire sector. There was literally the Bible and Harry Potter. And so we chose Harry Potter because we thought, well, we'll have a lot of fun.
Yeah, easier to track the author down as well, I imagine.
Exactly. That was very helpful as well. And so we started first with the 2003 edition of Harry Potter, the new Harry Potter book that was coming out at that time. We speed dated the Canadian publisher with a paper mill. We helped sort of broker the kind of quality of the paper that was needed, which was quite exacting. And then, moved them sort of closer to sort of reaching an agreement in terms of the order of that paper. And then we worked really closely with Raincoast Books, who were the Canadian publisher of Harry Potter, to engage JK Rowling in the initiative. Jo wrote a quote just for the Canadian edition of Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, which was the 5th book in the series. We did an eco-audit of it. Harry Potter was both massive in terms of its print run, as well as culturally. It was a cultural zeitgeist, right? Like a phenomenon. And so it just took off. Like Harry Potter fans were so excited about the fact that the Canadian edition was printed on paper that the Whomping Willow approved of. And so people were ordering the book from the US and from the UK and all over the place. And then we were very lucky to have, Jo got really engaged. She and her agent reached out to her other global publishers, encouraging them for the next book in the series to be printed on environmental paper. We started working with other NGOs to help support publishers in different jurisdictions to be able to find and access environmental paper that was either 100% recycled or a combination of recycled and Forest Stewardship Council certified wood fiber, which was what it was available at the time. And so by the time the 7th book rolled around in the series, so only 4 years after that initial standalone edition of the Canadian issue of Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix being printed on an ancient forest-friendly paper, there were 24 editions of Harry Potter that were published, including the massive kind of US print run, which was 12 million copies just by itself. And with that, there were 40 environmental papers that were produced, developed specifically for Harry Potter, that led to this broader shift in the number of environmental papers that were developed for publishers. I think there's now over 400, including most of those papers that were developed just for Potter continue to be standard inventory. So it was one of those game changer kind of leverage points that we were just in the right place at the right time and had fantastic partners in the publishing community as well as with JK Rowling.
Was it a game changer for you as an organization?
Yeah, I mean, I think definitely it helped prove the scale of change that we were talking about was actually possible. And it was possible in moments, right? Oftentimes we think of supply chains as changing over decades. But just as in the natural world, evolution can happen slowly. And then in these moments, I think what we saw with Harry Potter is that, one book, the leadership of one company, one publisher, stepping in and using and leveraging the opportunity that they had and the economy of scale that there was with that book actually changed the way that global publishing was done.
So the US has just elected a president who is, the climate doesn't figure highly on his agenda, I think it's safe to say.
Yes.
Are you optimistic for our future?
Yeah, I would say that yesterday was a tough day for sure. And the next 4 years, in many ways, across a myriad of issues that are near and dear to many of our hearts, are going to be very, very difficult. But I trend towards the glass being half full than the glass being half empty. And I see the work that we do with business leaders, I see every day that senior business leaders are stepping in, they're stepping up, that they recognize that governments aren't doing enough, even those that are leaning in to do something, that it's just not happening at the scale and the pace of change that's needed. Never alone governments like the new administration that will be coming into place in the US, who will be actively working in many ways probably to undermine what would be seen as climate positive and nature positive initiatives. And so oftentimes when there are market disruptions, sustainability initiatives get shipped onto the side burner. And what we've seen since COVID is that sustainability has moved up the priority stack. for business leaders. They are conscious that the traditional methods of production, these take, make, waste, linear extractive supply chains, just aren't viable moving forward. Supply chains are already being disrupted by the climate crisis. There were 18 million hectares of forest that burnt in Canada alone last year. That's not accounting for the forest fires that there were in Chile, Australia, Europe, the US, other places. It's literally a fiber basket that's going up in smoke. And so business leaders are recognizing that there needs to be a really kind of accelerated transition to more circular production that are lower impact and help keep these life support systems like forests standing. And so I think we will see different drivers, different societal drivers stepping forward to take leadership, given sort of what seems to be happening, not just in the US.
In the potential vacuum.
Yeah.
Yeah. Our time is up, Nicole. That was great. Thank you.
Okay.
Final question. What are your plans for the future?
Oof, good gracious. Like, you mean like 8:30, like in another 10 minutes? Or are you meaning kind of like, exactly. We're really all in on really catalyzing this transition of what are currently seen as forest products, paper, packaging, wood-based textiles like rayon and viscose, shifting them so that they are no longer leading to the destruction and the loss of these climate critical forests, and catalyzing that kind of transition to next-gen production. So that will fundamentally take the pressure off forests so that they can be protected for planetary stability. And as part of that, we're leaning in with our brand partners to make sure that the innovation pipeline is pulled through to market. We're starting to do work in the investment space, working with investors, both private equity, private capital, as well as some of the multilateral banks, to mobilize that $78 billion of capital and investment that's needed for this infrastructure transition in the next 10 years. And we're also developing some more regionalized focused work. So like the work that we started the conversation with, like regional hubs, like in India, in Brazil, in North America, in Europe, in other parts of Southeast Asia and China, recognizing that new industries tend to start in hubs or physical nodes. You know, like the textile production industry that used to be nestled sort of like in the upper part of England, or car manufacturing around the Great Lakes, because you don't just have a mill, you have the industrial ecosystem that goes around it, right? And so there are Canopy's plans between now and 2033.
Very good. Sounds like you have a bit on. I ought to go and let you have a bowl of cornflakes and a cup of coffee.
Okay. Awesome.
Nicole, thank you so much for your time. I really, really enjoyed that. I appreciate it.
Yeah, lovely. Lovely to spend the time. And I look forward to connecting in person when I'm next in the UK.
I look forward to that. I'll see you in London. Thank you, Nicole. To find out more about Nicole and Canopy, go to canopyplanet.org. As ever, to find other podcasts that I've done and to sign up to our newsletter, go to materialmatters.design. And there are images related to the interviews on our Instagram page, which is also materialmatters.design. Incidentally, you can now also find the show on YouTube Music, as well as Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, and a host of other places. There's absolutely no excuse not to listen. And it would make me incredibly happy if you went to my Patreon page and made a pledge at patreon.com/Material Matters. For as little as £2.50 a month, you can receive an invite to various Material Matters events, as well as getting access to each episode before it's published to the wider world. Material Matters is a completely independent concern, and any help you can offer would be hugely appreciated. Ultimately, you'll be helping to take the message of the importance of materials, skill, craft, and design to a whole new audience. Thanks very much for listening.